Greetings, friends. On behalf of Capella Romana and St. Vladimir's Orthodox Theological Seminary, we are pleased to welcome you to this discussion, Let My Prayer Arise, Music in the Experience of African American Orthodox Christians. My name is Rob Saylor, and I teach religion and culture at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis. I'm also a proud board member of Capella Romana and a longtime friend and fan of the Institute of Sacred Arts at St. Vladimir's Seminary. I'll be serving as moderator for this conversation. I'd like to begin by inviting Dr. Alexander Lingus, the founder and artistic director of Capella Romana, to say some words. Alex?
Thank you. I'd also like to extend my own welcome to the first in a series of online panels during the spring of 2021 that Capella Romana will be presenting in cooperation with academic partner institutions. These panels represent an extension of Capella Romana's pastoral and research work in the field of Orthodox liturgical music, especially its efforts to shed light on historically significant moments of creativity and cultural encounter from the ancient past to the modern present. This evening, it is my honor to be with you for this panel, Let My Prayer Arise, Music in the Experience of African American Orthodox Christians, which, as has already been said, is graciously co-sponsored by the Institute of Sacred Arts at St. Vladimir's Seminary. Let me turn you back over to our moderator, Professor Saylor.
Thank you, Alexander. Our topic today encompasses a range of issues: celebration of artistic excellence, dialogue about the depths of spiritual experience found throughout the Church. And we are also mindful as we gather of the ways in which the Orthodox Church in the United States, like the rest of this country, is currently carrying out its mission in the context of a national reckoning around matters of race. As we approach this Lenten season, we are reminded that if there is to be true reconciliation and peace, it must be built upon a foundation of truth-telling. And finally, always on our minds is the way that music and the arts can build bridges across the Church. Is there ecumenical potential in the sacred arts that is different from but complementary to theological dialogue? All of these and more are areas that we may explore during our panel discussion today. And I'm very excited at the speakers who have agreed to join the conversation. Let me introduce them briefly, and then after that, I'll give them a chance to say more about themselves. Father Turbo Qualls is the Dean of Chapters for the National Chapter of the Fellowship of St. Moses the Black. He's lectured in various parts of the United States in regard to the work of evangelization and cultural outreach within the U.S. As a former youth minister within the Evangelical Church, Father Turbo has dedicated much of his life and work to the pragmatic and tangible articulation of Orthodox spirituality to both young people and spiritual seekers. And he currently serves as the priest of St. Mary of Egypt Serbian Orthodox Church in Kansas City, Missouri. Mother Catherine Weston was brought up in the Episcopal Church and converted to the Orthodox faith in the 1980s, drawn by the beauty of the icons and the music. She has been a nun for 32 years and is the superior of the St. Xenia monastic community in Indianapolis for most of that time. In the 1990s, she was active in the fight against present-day slavery and human trafficking, but this led to a concern for the psychological trauma that may persist even after securing freedom. This in turn led her to earn a master's degree in counseling from Christian Theological Seminary and launch a private counseling practice where she specializes in trauma-informed care. She's also a founding member and president of the Fellowship of St. Moses the Black, as well as being a regular speaker at their annual conference, and she's published 5 books based on those presentations. Dr. Sean Wallace is the Director of Jazz Studies and Associate Professor of Jazz Saxophone at The Ohio State University. He also serves as Minister of Music and Worship Arts at Second Baptist Church. At Ohio State, he leads the Ohio Jazz Tech, which is the jazz faculty group, the Ohio Show Band, and the University Jazz Ensemble. He's been seen and heard nationally on a variety of outlets, and in addition to receiving recognitions from many newspapers and publications, including Billboard and Contemporary Christian Music magazine, he is the winner of Downbeat magazine's Outstanding Soloist Award. He's released 8 CDs, at least as of the time of this bio, as a multi-instrumentalist and is the leader of the Dr. Thunder Quartet. Dr. Peter Beteniev is professor of systematic theology at St. Vladimir's Seminary, where he's taught for 20 years. He co-founded the Arvo Pärt Project, and he's also the founding director of the Institute of Sacred Arts, which again is co-sponsoring this discussion. He's the author of a number of books in the areas of systematic theology, as well as theology of the arts, including 2 books and multiple articles on the composer Arvo Pärt. His teaching, publications, and public speaking all reflect a love of the arts and a commitment to engage them theologically. Now, having given the on-paper bios of our distinguished friends today, I'd like to invite them to put some flesh on those bones and to say more about themselves and their ministries in the church, especially as it relates both to sacred arts and matters of racial reconciliation and justice. Father Turbo, may we start with you?
Sure. Well, I think primarily where any type of authentic influence, at least for me, would come is more than my work here in Kansas City. I'll touch on that in a little bit, but first and foremost, I'm an Orthodox Christian who's a convert and an African American. So that experience is really the thing that drives my understanding. And I think that experience is also the primary thing that informs much of my work, because that experience is an experience of connecting with God and with the power that music, in particular, as we're speaking about here, sacred music, can move and motivate and inspire someone. Here, our parish, we are located in Kansas City, Missouri, and Kansas City, just to give a little bit of context, suffers from hyper-segregation still. And we are actually nestled, we moved a year ago, we're nestled even further on the east side, which is, that's how it's divided. East side is typically, poor and Black, and then the west side is not. And so we're nestled now in a neighborhood, and it's the hood, and it's wonderful. Actually, we have a little arc here, and the history of this parish and this community, it's long-standing, long before I was the priest, and its history is rooted in trying to actually incarnate this idea of reconciliation, and I think that the key movement has been primarily around connection, and I would argue that this is probably the thing that we need to understand the most about music, and that is the fact that it either connects or it doesn't connect with someone, and beginning to understand what are the means by which connection can happen. Because although I see myself a bit of like a kind of neophyte mystic, I think the reality is that it's not all mystical, meaning that there's actual things that can be done to facilitate that connection. And I think a lot of the discussion around these issues gets obfuscated with a certain lack of understanding, and that there's some pragmatic things that can be done, and those things, once they're done, a lot of the work that continues to need to be done, primarily in evangelization, and which is the key means of reconciliation, those things become really apparent and become a lot easier to engage. But it all begins with your experience first. If I can't show someone the depth of the heart if I haven't been there myself first, and I can't explain to someone the value and the power of their suffering, and the value and the power of being, kind of in that dark night of the soul, if I haven't been there myself first. So it's with those things of experience first, personal experience, and then having that be shaped and formed by tradition and a more Catholic understanding, some really powerful things can happen.
Thank you, Father Turbo. Mother Catherine, could you say more about how these issues intersect in your own life and ministry?
Here we go. Took a couple of tries. So as far as the arts are concerned, I've been known primarily for iconography. not as much for music, but music has been a lifelong interest and passion of mine. I did not grow up singing in the choir, as so many African American stories begin, but I did uh, sing in school choruses, um, learned guitar, made compositions, learned how to notate music because of that. And then in Orthodoxy, have been in the Kleros from the time I was a catechumen. So also teaching other people how to do the services, all of that has been part of my Orthodox journey. I would say the first time that I began to intuit that there was a dialogue to be had between Orthodox culture, Orthodox liturgical worship and the African American expression was when I was still a catechumen in the 80s, when I did a little skit that included a Vespers portion that used the scaffolding of the Orthodox Vespers and then brought in African American elements. For instance, a Humanon based on they that wait on the Lord shall renew their strength, things like that. So that was the beginning of wondering about how that dialogue could unfold. So I think I'll let it rest at that point.
Marvelous. Well, there'll be more to say later on, I'm sure. But Dr. Wallace, could you share how this intersection has played out in your own work?
So anyhow, I grew up in a non-denominational sort of tradition, by the way, which is another denomination just called non-denominational. And in that kind of tradition, there are certain kind of questions that I always had, that I didn't really feel satisfied by the answers of. And so when I was in college, I was a comparative religion minor. And as a comparative religion minor, I took a Christian tradition course. It was taught by an ex-Catholic priest who cussed like a sailor, by the way, writing class. And that was kind of an interesting experience, but I was exposed to the reality that there was a church called the Orthodox Church that I was not aware of, and he started bringing up sort of issues of stuff like apostolic successions, not a term that I related to at all, but later on, as I became less and less satisfied with sort of answers that I was getting, a buddy of mine started sending me articles about the Orthodox Church, and I was totally hooked. As soon as I found out about it, I rushed right in to the Orthodox Church. It didn't take me very long. I belonged to a church in Columbus, Ohio, called St. Gregory of Nyssa, right off, I saw that, I thought that my music, my sort of experience with music, I'm a jazz musician by training. I have several recordings out. I was like, I wonder if there's a way to sort of combine, the experience I've had working in sort of Protestant churches with what's going on in the Orthodox Church. So, backed by Lee Zappas, who was very generous and funded this project. We did this project called How Sweet the Sound, where we presented, several selections of Black gospel setting of an Orthodox Vespers, and Dr. Peter Beteniev was part of that. He was one of the presenters. And that's probably why you were interested in having me on the panel. So I'll stop there.
Absolutely. It's, well, Dr. Beteniev, as Dr. Wallace said, you were involved in that presentation of the Gospel Vespers, and then also in your capacity as director of the Institute of Sacred Arts, you think on these questions often of how the arts speak into the church. Tell us more about your thinking and experience with this in your own work.
Yeah, thanks. It's so wonderful to be here among this beautiful company. And what Dr. Wallace, Dr. Thunder, did not tell you is that he is the composer of that Vespers service and of those compositions that together constituted a Vespers service in the Orthodox tradition, but musically in the Black Gospel tradition. And my participation in that was a game changer for me, to just see what's possible in all of these kinds of things we're talking about today. It was extremely moving, and I hope we can weave in some clips from that into this presentation. I'm a lifelong musician, lifelong Orthodox Christian as well. I've always sung in choirs or conducted them, and I was educated at New England Conservatory in the late 70s and early 80s in jazz and in what was then called third stream. And that's, I think, significant because by definition, that program involved some very, very deep ear training. Which means listening, which I hope to get back to later on during this conversation, the importance of listening. And listening is everything. But then listening to widely eclectic musical traditions and freely incorporating them into your own musical vocabulary, in whatever your own idiom is. You can be either knowingly or unknowingly now somehow incorporating the music of North India, the music of Ghana, the music of the Javanese gamelan, And so at the same time, I was rooted in jazz, and as a jazz musician, like Dr. Sean, I'm glad to see the basses behind you, Dr. Sean. I joined the club here. You're conscious that there are music traditions that have a kind of a lineage, and they're related by lineage, like jazz and gospel and rhythm and blues, and so there's a kind of a tie that you can point to historically and culturally. But then there's also, as Father Turbo said, there's like music can either resonate with you or not. It can either speak to you or not, regardless of tradition. And so one of the really interesting things in this whole conversation is what of each other's musical traditions resonates, what sounds good to you, as a human being, but also as an African American human being, and you can find that resonance in surprising places, if we all dare to listen to each other, And so the work that we're doing, the Institute of Sacred Arts, it has a lot to do with listening across traditions, looking across traditions. We're involved in some sort of very academic questions of, like, in sacred arts, what does it mean that something is sacred? But we're not only asking, kind of card-carrying Orthodox Christians that question. We're as interested in what anyone says about that question. So I'll leave it there. I'm just so happy to be talking with everyone here.
Well, and I think I want to pick up on just that exact word, resonance. There's maybe a stodgy way of asking the question, how does the Orthodox musical tradition dialogue with African American musical traditions? But I think maybe the better way to ask it, based on what you all have said, is when we think about these rich historical streams of music coming from different vantage points across the globe and from within this country, what is it that you have found and have experienced as resonant between Eastern Orthodox musical traditions and African American musical traditions, however construed? What resonate? What speaks across those traditions? And I'm going to throw that open to whoever would like to answer first.
I'll jump in. So one thing I have found greatly interesting is So I'm the minister of music at a missionary Baptist church. Now, understand that a missionary Baptist church is not the same as like an evangelical Baptist church, right? Or like a Southern Baptist church or something. A missionary Baptist church, which is a black church, tends to be a black church, there is a much more developed liturgy. There is a much more reverence of so as far as what clothing is worn, the choir all have robes on. You know, the minister has a robe on. You know, when he's preaching often is the case. In any given service, I'm programming 14 or 15 selections. And so the music is rather woven throughout the service in a way that is not usually the case in like a mega church or something. You know, maybe a mega church, maybe you'd have like worship in the beginning of the service, worship. So, you know, praise and worship, you'd have maybe 20 minutes or something, 15 minutes. And then you'd have maybe announcements, and then maybe some special selection or something, then the sermon. And then after the sermon, you'd probably have sort of either sort of some kind of altar call selection or something like that. But understand that basically the music is rather segregated from the service, right? It has its own space, but it's not really intertwined with the rest of the service. But not so in a missionary Baptist church. In a missionary Baptist church, the organ, in particular, the organ is sort of through composed over the entire service. In fact, during the sermon, so say the beginning of the sermon, organ is probably playing, and then maybe once the minister says the prayer or does the scripture reading, then organist will stop. The sermon, whatever it is, 3 points, usually, right? 3 or 4 points. And then at the end of the service, something happens called tuning up. Now, tuning up is when the organist will have a certain kind of relationship with the minister. They'll know what key that they tend to sing in, what key their preaching suggests, and they'll start there. And often it's the case that there will be successive modulations. And the preacher is intent, he is driving home whatever the central point was in the sermon. And the organ is playing on top of, in between, you know, all kinds of things, right? So my point is that I think there's a great deal in common with the way that an Orthodox service is, where the music is throughout. It's indistinguishable from the words spoken, from the content, right? It's all one thing. It's very holistic, right? So I find that that was one of the things immediately when I walked into an Orthodox church. I was like, oh snap, you know, this. I see what's, you know, yeah, the aesthetic is different. You know, the you know, a cappella singing for the most part, that's different. There's aspects that are different, but there's so much that is the same when you get beyond those sort of superficial differences.
Marvelous. Other thoughts on this?
Yeah.
Mother Catherine?
I found that's, am I unmuted?
Yep.
Yeah. Okay, I found that so very interesting, what Dr. Sean Wallace was saying. And before he spoke, the main resonance I would say was in the spirit of the sorrowful joy that you would find both in African American worship and in the Orthodox worship, more than the musicality itself, but the underlying spirit, I think, is an important starting point as well.
Can you tell us more what you mean by sorrowful joy? I think that's such an important concept here.
Yeah. It's not a triumphalism. It's not a patting myself on the back because I'm Christian and I'm saved and I know I'm saved. It's reaching out from the valley of the shadow of death, sometimes with Christ being what pulls us through, or prayers to the Theotokos, what gives us courage for day-to-day life. And so we're able to experience joy in the midst of sorrow, as opposed to a prosperity gospel. It's very different from the prosperity gospel.
I should have been playing the organ when you were talking there at the end there.
Yeah. Well, and if I may, Dr. Beteniev, I know that this bright sorrow, sorrowful joy, that's something you've been thinking about in terms of the Orthodox tradition in your own writings. Would you agree that there's that particular resonance there?
Very, very deeply so. There's one line that we sing at Resurrection Matins. We sing, "Lo, through the cross, joy has come into all the world." It's such a mind-blowing line, because what is the cross? It's an instrument of death and torture, and somehow there it is. Joy comes through it. And when I was listening to both Mother Catherine and Dr. Wallace talking, one of the factors that united what you said, well, two of them, was a kind of an integration of music and message, music and preaching, and the other is a kind of truth telling, that the liturgy and the arts, they don't sugarcoat anything. They're about the raw reality that is true, both to the joy and to the sorrow. And it's like we human beings have solidarity with each of those, and we're invited into Christ's sorrow and Christ's joy, so through him our own sorrow and our own joy is just somehow made fulfilled, and since we're all in him, then we all share in each other's sorrow and joy, and it's impossible to express how profound and beautiful that is. I take note too that Albert Raboteau, who's a very dear friend, and another African American convert to the Orthodox Church from the Catholic Church, he wrote a kind of a spiritual autobiography, and the title of it is Sorrowful Joy. It's no coincidence. It's a very beautiful testimony to his life as an African American, as an Orthodox Christian, and as someone trying to make sense of all of these things.
It's stunning. Father Turbo, I wonder, in your own work, and as you've talked about this, how have you found it best to describe the way in which these different streams come together, these different historical and musical streams? What are some helpful, evocative ways to think about that in your own ministry?
Well, I mean, first of all, obviously, I want to just echo what Dr. Beteniev was saying. And also, I mean, Dr. Sean's input was actually very fascinating. If I could, I just really want to comment on that for a second.
Please.
Because one of the things in my short time of really contemplating, but being in a place to try things, or to really have my contemplation actually move forward in any meaningful way, one of the problems has always been a lack of understanding of how, and again, I'll use the word in kind of almost strategic sense, how that intersection would be even possible. And so that was very insightful, actually. And I find that that's one of the things that's very important, but it also leads me to an understanding of something else, which is, I think the differences, and this is again from my own limited experience, but one of the big differences is that kind of starting point. So Dr. James Cone, many years ago, I want to say, gosh, it is maybe the minimum 15 years ago, there was a conference that Tavis Smiley was moderating. I can't remember if he's the one who actually put it on, but in that conference, he was speaking about how the reality of the loss of the cross for the Black church, the reality of the Black church, he's speaking in a more generalized sense, you know, caring more, trying to preserve itself in a worldly sense, in the sense of success, as opposed to losing its life. He presented this and it set the room on fire. And I bring that up because I think this is one of the things that we have to understand, which is there needs to be a portion, which Dr. Sean articulated incredibly well. I'm still really kind of thinking about what he said, but there's this portion of really how do we approach it? Because, you know, I've been playing, when I was a music major before I left that. And at my little time there was jazzers, there was the classical guys, and there was the street guys, right? And so I was one of the street guys, and the street guys were the ones who played in bands and, you know, did all that stuff, and they found themselves for usually trying to be in recording or production. That's why I was there. But I played in bands my whole life, rock bands, right? And my dad owned a record store, and I grew up immersed in music. Music was my culture, and subculture is my culture, fundamentally. I learned how to move in this world. It was a chariot. It was a piece of armor. It was camouflage. Subculture and music in particular allowed me to move in the world at times when other aspects of my quote unquote identity were maybe more vulnerable than I would like. You know, growing up in a predominantly white area, or oftentimes being, you know, whatever it is, always having that kind of acute awareness of being like the lone guy. I found the arts in general, I'm also an artist, but music and the culture that I grew up with, again, my father having a record store, it opened up an understanding and a way to see the world that wasn't tied to the same measures of success as everyone else. This is something that I found resonating when I had my conversion, when I was beginning to follow Christ. And I went to my mom's missionary Baptist church, by the way. And there was something different there. And it was different than my grandmother's Episcopalian church, right? There was, I almost would say, there was, you know, a kind of an all-in aspect to it. And that all-in aspect was, at least the people that I had contact with at my mom's missionary Baptist church, there was like a seriousness that was there. And there was an almost otherworldliness that was there that I didn't experience, again, like at my grandmother's Episcopalian church, or, you know, I went to, you know, an Assembly of God church, I went to a private school in grade school with Assembly of God. I didn't experience that same type of thing. So this experience of my father owning a record store, growing up in music, you know, playing in bands, being in an underground scene, this common thread for me was that music can become this, again, like I said, a chariot which can move you through spaces. It can become armor which can allow you to move through spaces with a certain amount of protection, a certain amount of awareness. And it facilitates a self-awareness that I think both orthodoxy and the root of African American experience have really in common. See, and this is where, to weave it all through, suffering and an awareness of suffering and a refusal to avoid suffering, whether it's going to be through, prosperity, teaching, kind of a false ecstatic experience, any of those things that people can use to avoid the acute pain of that deep reflection. It's very powerful. And this is what Dr. Cohn was getting at. Maybe not necessarily in the specific context of the music, but this is what he was getting at in regards of where he felt the quote unquote Black church had gone wrong. And this is where, in our best points, where are we at our best points as Orthodox Christians during Lent, right? What's Lent all about? It's about we're supposed to not flinch the whole year round as Orthodox Christians. But during Lent in particular, we learn really not to flinch. And we really learn to kind of stare everything, including primarily ourselves, in the face with a steely eye. That generates something musically. And I think that when you now understand that, and that needs to be the focus that you don't leave from, then your technical understanding of modes and all the aspects of how you actually create music are now properly in service of where you're trying to get to. But you have to have the horse to drive the chariot, not the other way around. And I think that will probably be, or at least should be, that common thread that's going to guide this discussion, not just for this forum today, but in the future, is this understanding of maintaining that tension of that joyful sorrow, because it's not morose. It isn't this kind of, a despondency. It's different. But it is that tension that I think really allows people to enter into something that is powerful and moving, and again, moving like a chariot, not moving like an emotional experience. It's different. It's something that motivates you into something profoundly different. When you are being moved like a chariot by music, you become something else. You're able to enter into a space where you can embody something higher. You can change yourself and the world around you for good. And that is something that I think music, and in particular, music in a sacred space, that's its whole purpose, right? But if you don't keep that focus, well, then you're dealing with something else.
Peter?
I just wonder, I'm grateful for that, Father Turbo. There's so much in what you just said. And I just want to test something on you and on others. It is one thing that I'm hearing that, on the one hand, there are different idioms, musical idioms within a worshiping church. There's a Slavic Orthodox idiom, there's a Byzantine Orthodox idiom, there's a number of different idioms in historic Black churches, with some overlap and some not. And so it is part of what all of us in a way are saying, is that there's another level to all this that transcends idiom. And that level is words like you just used, Father Turbo, unflinching, words like truth-telling, words like sorrowful joy, joyful sorrow. It's the character such that if someone is either intoning in a very kind of a historical kind of Byzantine chant, or someone is singing kind of a four-part Slavic harmony kind of a thing, or if someone is singing in a kind of a Black gospel influenced mode, it's like that's just the clothing, and there's something inside that is capable potentially of resonating with all of us across the traditions. Is that too bold a thing to suggest? I don't know.
Yeah, I like that idea. I'm very, and that's not to say that there's no difference and that the aesthetic doesn't matter. It doesn't mean that, but it does mean that we're trying to communicate a message. We're trying to participate as an act of worship, right? So that's like the deeper stuff, you know, the stuff that matters. In not that another language, for instance, doesn't sound differently to the ear, but it's what is meant by that language that is spoken that really matters. When I was listening to you, Father Turbo, and you were saying that there was something else there in this missionary Baptist church that you attended when you were younger. I'm not suggesting that missionary Baptist churches are essentially different than other Protestant churches. But what I am here to say is that the missionary Baptist church is far more orthodox than other kinds of Baptist churches. And I think that, at least for me, that's what has kept me being able to continue working the job that I'm working, when it has been at the expense of my ability to regularly attend the church that I belong to, is because there is this orthodoxy, and there still is, although it's come under attack, there still is a reverence and respect of God's order of things. This whole, patriarchy is taken a lot of, it's like a favorite whipping boy of most everyone these days. But patriarchy, in its essence, is a good thing. It's not a bad thing, and as a lot of these different sort of versions of Christianity and religions in general have sort of began to bend the knee to the sort of feminist agenda, what it has done, it has in record numbers, especially in the black church, black men are leaving. They're leaving the church because there doesn't seem to be something there that is speaking to them and for them. And I'm not here to attack the Protestant churches or black churches or anything like that. That's not the point. But I think my point is, for me, the answer to that problem was orthodoxy. That was the answer to that problem.
Forgive me if I could, I just want to highlight something. And to be clear, I didn't interpret it that way at all, because for me, it was the people that were at that Missionary Baptist Church that were serious. And to drive my point home, there was a period.
By the way, I realized that. By the way, I just wanted to clarify. Go ahead. I'm sorry.
But to drive that point home, because I think it's really pertinent to the conversation. There was a period of my time, which is very common actually, where it's kind of like I have these multiple adolescent phases where I'll get into something, a style of music or whatever, and then like I kind of I'm beyond that, and I don't want anything to do with it, and then I kind of come back around to it. That's what happens when you're into a lot of genres and things like that. So at any rate, for various reasons, no need to get into it necessarily here, but I went through a season of time where I really, to put it lightly, I didn't appreciate my background as an African American. Particularly, my grandmother on my father's side was a Pentecostal minister. My mother was very deeply involved in her church, you know, so there's roots there for me. And it wasn't until actually I started going to Platina, St. Herman of Alaska Monastery in Platina. And the now abbot, Abbot Damascene, he wasn't the abbot at the time, but him and some of the other fathers there, they started giving, they gave me like a tape on gospel music. They're like, oh, do you ever listen to any gospel music? I was like, I wasn't there to want to listen to gospel music. And it was interesting because it was through them that I began to really appreciate my roots again. And the reason why I bring that up is because the gospel music that they gave me, which wasn't all just pure gospel, right? They also, Father Damascene also gave me Blind Willie Johnson, which is like one of my favorites to this day, right? What was it? There was a gravitas to the music that they gave me. And whether it was Blind Willie, you know, playing his, you know, form of Delta blues, or whether it was the Fisk Jubilee Singers, there was a seriousness that was there. There was the seriousness, and there was an otherworldliness that was there that you could grab onto. And I think that's really the thing that I find consistent, because to Dr. Beteniev's point, anyone who's got a human heart, right? You can open your heart or your ears to, you know, let's not say a myriad, but if you're presented with a myriad of music, you'll be able to pull out certain gems that will touch you. And what you'll find is, there's a measure of being subjective, but there's also a measure where we're talking objectively about something. And what you'll find is there are some key things that will run through there, right? And I think that this is really important to take in mind, because one of the things that's kind of in the background playing is we would like to see some sort of intersection happen. And that intersection going beyond just kind of episodic kind of events. We would like to see something really kind of sprout up organically and have a life in regards of Orthodox life, Orthodox church, and the African American experience. But the thing that's missing in many ways is part of what this discussion is really trying to hopefully nail down in a more concrete way for the future, a path by which people who are interested and feel led by the Lord to really facilitate some of these things, that there's going to be some sort of common order, some sort of common map, some sort of common recipe book that people will pull from. And, you know, there's 30 different ways to have gumbo, but there's a certain thread that's there that eventually you go like, I've had 30 gumbos, but it's all gumbo. But the thing is, we need to know, what are we making, you know, because gumbo isn't split pea soup, right? So I think this is, again, in regards to kind of guiding the conversation, some of these ways that we're talking about experiences that can be dangerously subjective. And what I mean dangerously subjective is that they will keep us kind of spinning the wheels versus narrowing down more and more and more, like what is that thing, insofar as, you know, trying to catch the wind, if you will, but what is that thing that we all keep encountering that we can kind of begin to try to put our finger on, you know?
If I might, thank you, Father Turbo, that I wanted to maybe just, following up from what you said, push back a little against my friend and colleague, Peter Beteniev, just on the phrase, just the clothing. I mean, that's one of the things about Orthodox music, is that on the one hand, it really is the one way, given that since the 15th century, we more or less use all the same services, that it's the one real way that Orthodox liturgy indigenizes, is enculturated with the different musical traditions. But at the same time, that there is within each of those traditions that has arisen a kind of that depth, that seriousness of purpose that you've talked about, that you and Dr. Wallace also saw in the missionary Baptist churches as well. And precisely, I think that's one of the things that in this historical moment where you're dealing with a country of largely immigrants, people brought there either willingly or unwillingly to the United States, and then without those many centuries of historical depth, what do we do? How do we proceed forward? Because that's the way Orthodoxy has really usually had indigenization over a very long durée.
I'm glad to be pushed back, especially by such a dear and longtime friend. You're absolutely right, of course, Alex. Well, among other things, I think part of what I think you might be saying is that it's impossible to extricate the content from the form, right? I mean, as Rob Saylor has said in many different ways in his writing, the faith is always embodied. The messages always takes some kind of form, and that form is going to be through words, through music, through the senses, and such that, as St. Paul says, we have this treasure in earthen vessels, and we don't even know the treasure apart from those vessels, and so those vessels of different cultures are indispensable, and they somehow kind of they're not entirely teasable apart from the core, from the message. I guess what I was just trying to say is that miraculously that same message and some of the same things some of the qualities that we're trying to talk about here is seriousness, integration, anti-dualism, joyful sorrow, that these can be found. Maybe earlier I misspoke. I was almost saying like despite the music, but what I meant to say is in and through very different musical forms. I appreciate this exchange.
Mother Catherine?
So our Orthodox faith is based on revelation. And revelation is, by definition, then top down. So that builds a hierarchy. So we were talking about patriarchy, feminism, all these things. Our own generation is so deep mired in materialism that anything that pertains to that spiritual hierarchy can be assailed, but that's exactly what we have to preserve that keeps it orthodox. So based on revelation, the music needs to take us back up that pyramid toward God. And it can't just be what's popular, it can't just be what resonates, yes, but it has to be the spirit that resonates more than the form. So I'm thinking about Mariška Michaela when she first entered an Orthodox church and turned to Father Paisius, the future Father Paisius, and said, I don't know about you, but I'm going to be Orthodox. It was something of that spirit. And if a person is looking for that, if they're hungry for that. So, we have to keep attention between keeping our eye on that revelatory characteristic of orthodoxy and wanting to embody that, and forms that resonate with people. It has to be both and.
Yeah, yeah, both and. Yeah, so it seems like what we're talking about is this sort of balancing act between the sort of otherworldliness that we want to experience as we go into an Orthodox church for worship, right? And the language that we need to use to communicate the message, right? So you have to speak in a language that people understand, but we don't want that to take away from the otherworldliness that they experience. And yeah, that's like the needle that we're trying to thread with all of this.
Let me pick up on that just because I want to pull together some of these really profound threads that we've been laying out here and think about our own present moments. You know, we in our national moment of reckoning following the murder of George Floyd, new questions are being asked. It's not that situations are new. It's not that these modes of oppression haven't been around for a long, long time, but new questions are being asked, both about the role of the church and the role of arts organizations like Capella Romana, like the Institute for Sacred Arts, when it comes to matters of racial justice specifically. So what can the church, by being the church, bring to this moment of reckoning? And specifically when it comes to the modes of beauty and music that we're talking about, what does that bring to this national conversation?
Well, if I could, I would just start with that and dovetailing off of what Mother Catherine very poignantly put forward to us to remind us. And I think what the church needs to do is to stay the church and do what the church does, which is to bring men to remembrance of themselves. We just went through both the prodigal son as well as the publican and the Pharisee. And in both those Sundays, I was trying to bring the point home to my parish that in both cases you have a situation of people not remembering themselves, forgetting themselves. The prodigal son, it's only until he comes to himself, he sees himself, he remembers himself, that he rises and he goes to his father's house. When you look at, the Pharisee, and although the Pharisee prayed, quote unquote, correct in form, there was a forgetting of himself because he was not aware of the need that he still had of God. He wasn't aware of his humbleness, the need for his humbleness before God. And although the publican, the sinner he was, he knew who he was, and he was aware, and he remembered that he was that sinner, which allowed him to enter rightly before God, right? So he was accounted righteous because he remembered himself and he humbled himself, therefore, before God. And I think that that piece of revelation and understanding that is the key. Meaning, fundamentally, we aren't trying to, and we should never fall in the trap that most of the churches, and this is not a jab, I'm talking technically speaking, including much of the Roman Catholic Church, forget the call and end up chasing something else. How do we become more relevant? How do we get more people? How do we make people feel more better? Whatever the case is, that's a forgetting of yourself. Our charge is to be a people set apart, and we are to honor that charge by remembering ourselves. And when we remember ourselves in that sense, we'll do what we need to do. In my own work with people who have gone through significant things, their own moments and points of trauma, I'm always trying to get someone to remember themselves, to not have themselves be subsumed and lost to whatever terrible experience that has, taken them over. And I think that this is more than ever what the world needs, because let us not forget, we've entered a new age. And this new age, which some people have rightly coined the dim age, is a time in which much is going to be lost and is already lost. And in some regards, without any type of sensationalism, some could argue that the Orthodox Church is like the kind of lodestone that's left to kind of point to deeper truths, which affect every aspect of us, right? Because here's the other piece of it. The traumas, the pain, the anguish, the fear, all the things that were the result of, this last year and this season of, outrage and protest and riot and all of the things that have happened in all kinds of areas, right? This comes from a people, and I don't mean necessarily just African Americans, but just as human beings, as Americans, wherever there was some sort of unrest, when people lose a sense of themselves, being connected and being made in the image of God, this is the fruit of it. And so there's contemplative aspects that the church puts forward in a very implied way. It's an implied contemplative, experience. And that's important, because when it becomes too explicit, then it becomes self-conscious, and then you're not able to really communicate in any authentic way, and then people just feel like, oh, this is another gimmick. See, that's one of the things is, again, it has to be really, as Mother said, it has to be birthed out of this understanding of revelation and a desire to stay steadfast and faithful to that, not out of a kind of self-consciousness that's more informed by any type of kind of political paradigm, but rather a remembering of oneself, so that one can maintain health and integrity of person. And that's one of the things that the liturgy does for us. We offer the liturgy for Christ's sake and for our sake as well, but that's one of the things that it does for us, is it maintains that integrity for us as human beings. It keeps the whole person together. So I think this is one of the things to keep in mind. And that's a way that just by maintaining that line, if you will, and offering the world strong medicine, strong drink, nothing diluted, right? Because we know where that leads. We know where that leads. We need to, keep the chrism as it needs to be passed down so that it can do the work, right? And that's what the world's needing in regards of issues of reconciliation, right?
Yeah, I should be playing the organ now too. Yeah, facts. So remember that this whole thing started because a black man was killed. Okay? And there's a long history of this sort of disproportionate violence against black men. Okay? There's a long history of that. And there has been sort of uprisings in the past, and they last for a time, and then they dissipate, and then nothing really different has really happened. It's really still been the same issues. In fact, I would argue that the issues have become worse. But what the politicians and the certain groups have been able to do is they've been able to use the attention that this sort of violence against black men has sort of brought certain things to a head. They use that attention to serve whatever agenda that they have. We get passed over. Black men get passed over. We are the least catered to group as black men. And one thing that the Orthodox Church will never do is invalidate the humanity of every person. We matter. God sees us. And much of what you see on the news, and much of what I've experienced, in academia, in different walks of life, different things that I do, is yeah, it seems that right now people are more willing to have a conversation. But I remember, I have a memory. I know how this stuff usually goes. So it's hard to trust that somehow this is going to be different. And actually, you can see how, in most respects, how it's not any different at all, because the same sorts of things have crept up, and this leaving in their wake the same problems. Yeah, I mean, so the church is always the answer. Actually valuing men and having a specific place where we are to serve in a manner by which we are to serve. That matters. And again, it's one of the reasons why Orthodoxy is so appealing to me, is that as was just said, the strong drink that comes with it, the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
So I'd like to segue off of what both of you have said. Can you hear me? Okay. In addition to being true to itself and helping us come to ourselves through that, I have a vision where the Orthodox Church could in some way acknowledge our enslaved forebears who gave their blood and their lives to pray to Christ. In almost every Orthodox country, the blood of the martyrs has been the seed of the church. And there's been honor towards the first ones who shed their blood for Christ. And the fellowship has, over the years, collected the names and martyrologies, both in Wade in the River and in Unbroken Circle, of people who have enslaved men and women who were forbidden to pray because the enslavers feared that either they would pray for freedom or that they would pray against the master. And so we have those who are confessors, we have those who gave their blood. Now, in the early centuries, before there were any denominations, you had baptism by blood. So a person didn't have to be baptized into the church if they shed their blood for Christ. St. Boniface was one of those. He was leading a very dissolute life, witnessed the martyrdom of some of the saints and said, "Oh, I'm one of them." And then he also was martyred. And it was that quick, that immediate. Now that you have denominations, I'm not saying that the Orthodox Church can say that people who never heard of Orthodoxy can then be retrofitted as Orthodox saints, but there can be some way to honor them, whether it's, as Deacon Jonathan Rivas suggested, historical scenes of their suffering, perhaps, or triumph in narthexes of certain parishes that were open to that, or whether it could be non-liturgical songs that were still written in an Orthodox ethos.
Well, I knew coming into this conversation that it would be viscerally painful for me to bring it to a close. So much good. I actually can't say enough how touched I am by a number of things that have come up in our all too brief time together. Speaking for myself, and I imagine speaking for many of those who will be listening, I've heard much to ponder. Talk of bright sadness, talk of deep truth-telling, talk of the strong medicine of the church and as it relates to beauty. One thing I want to make very clear again is our hope that this will be an ongoing conversation, not just among those of us who work in these areas directly, but across the whole church and across all those who it touches and across all of the many people who make up the listenership of Capella Romana and the viewership of the Institute for Sacred Arts. I want to especially thank Father Turbo, Mother Catherine, Dr. Wallace, and Dr. Beteniev for joining us today. And in this Lenten season, I wish deep blessings upon us all. Thank you so much.